The book's called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. Now, does anyone here know who Martin Bormann was? No, that was Albert Speer, who was Hitler's armaments minister and also architect, who Prince Charles is a big admirer of, and who's quite well described in Jonathan Meade's TV programme that he did, a half-hour, I think it's maybe even 40-minute long programme called Jerry Building. Now, this is a really powerful programme. If you've never seen it, watch it online, because it's all about Nazi architecture, and all that their architecture tells you about the cult nature of their society. And funnily enough, when the BBC released Jonathan Meade's collection of his films, that best and most important film is not on the collection, which kind of leads me on to explaining a bit more about Jonathan Meade's and that. But let's finish with Martin Bormann first. Bormann, I don't know how many people know how Hitler used to run his empire. It was basically, Adolf was in charge, but all of his minions, what he used to do is he used to play this divide and rule thing with them. So every position, there were two or possibly even more people vying for that position and for his favour. So he could play one off against the other. And they were constantly trying to ingratiate themselves to Hitler, to do more and more for him. And this meant that they would get more and more ruthless. So this is the way that these modern day hierarchical systems work too, is you're constantly giving the impression to, say for example, your middle managers in a corrupt business, like one of the big oil companies, that they can make it to the top, but only if they show their loyalty by doing exactly what you want and the stuff that you've asked them to do down the pub, off the record. And Hitler used to do this all the time. And the most important position through the Nazi years was this deputy to Hitler. Now, there were two people. Bormann was one, and does anyone know the name of the other one who's played off against? See, this is our history. We've really got to know this. We fought these people. Our grandparents, aunties and uncles died fighting them, and yet we don't necessarily understand how they operated, because the history, okay, there's bits and pieces on the Yesterday channel, but we don't necessarily understand it. The other guy was Hermann Hesse, right? There were two through most of the early part of the war who were vying constantly for Hitler's favour as his deputy, Martin Bormann and Rudolf Hess. Now, however you want to characterise it, Hess was an interesting guy. I mean, I think actually he got to a certain stage down the road in Nazi Germany where he realised, actually, this thing that we've created in Germany is like a monstrous idea. And he decided on his own that he would try and make peace with Britain. This was, by the way, was a way of trying to ingratiate himself to Hitler again, right? By going on a secret mission to Britain. And he parachuted out of a plane into up in Scotland somewhere, and then he was captured. But the reason he did this is because he'd been going to Hitler's Berghof with Bormann as well, all dining with Hitler. So you've got Hess and Bormann both vying for his... And for whatever reason, Hess did not like to eat the food that Hitler was serving, whereas Bormann was happy, eating away. And Hess brought his own chef. And Hitler noticed at one of the meals, you haven't been eating my food, right? And this was very hurtful to Hess, because he thought, oh no, I've fallen out of favour. And this was one of the reasons he decided to make this flight to Britain. And he parachuted up into Scotland, where he knew there was a very high-ranking and actually quite pro-Nazi Lord, Hamilton, I think it was. And he parachuted into his place. Anyway, he was captured, and the rest is history. He spent the rest of his life in Spandau prison. But this left Bormann as the key guy, right? So Bormann had all the power now. And he was a bureaucrat. He was very boring. He did things like set up businesses, set up companies, organised the lower echelons of the Nazi party, and also, most importantly, he was basically Hitler's treasurer. So all of the wealth that was being looted across Europe from 1939 all the way through to actually 38, all the way through till 1945, Bormann was in charge of where it was going. I mean, the thing is, the types of stuff that was being looted were obviously precious metals, things like gold, that kind of thing. Every time the Nazis came to a new estate, they'd go straight for the cellars and for the safes to try and find all of the loot. There were also securities, that is to say, share certificates, this kind of thing, all very valuable material. Artwork, paintings, all of this was very systematically brought back to Berlin. And the other thing is patents. Sometimes there were like secret plans of new ideas, technical expertise. This was all very valuable stuff. And as the Nazi armies rolled across Europe, this was what they were, one of their prime roles was to identify this stuff and get it back to Berlin. And it was Bormann's job to be in charge of all this. So this book, Nazi in Exile, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, was really the only examination of what happened to Bormann after the war. Because when Hitler died in his bunker, I know there's some people that don't believe he did, I certainly do believe he did, and I spoke to someone who saw his body as well, who lives in, still alive and lives in Marlborough, a guy called Harry Beckhoff. He escaped down these Vatican rat lines to Switzerland originally, and then eventually to South America. And if you ever see an old World in Action film, was made in the 1970s by John Ware, who's now the head of Panorama at the BBC, even though now he seems to be a bit of a gatekeeper. He was filming over in Paraguay and Brazil, filming these Nazis. Well, I mean, he was over there filming places where they'd identified as being living. Now, but Bormann hadn't been idle over there. He was a very busy little bureaucrat, and as soon as the war was finished and he made it over to South America, he started setting up companies. He set up 750 new firms in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And in those new firms, what he did is he made supporters of the SS, the international supporters of the SS, and he made actual SS people. Obviously, they'd taken their SS uniforms off and their swastikas off, and they put nice suits on, and they were now directors of companies. They were no longer Nazis in uniform, they were directors of companies. And these companies, many of them still exist today. The only thing is, there was a whole money laundering operation going on, so a lot of these paintings were sold on the black market, etc. And the money that they raised, that Bormann raised, for example, there's absolute cast iron evidence now that a lot of the gold that was in Nazi gold bars with the Nazi crest on was taken up to New York to Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, and that they arranged for it to be laundered, melted down, and turned into Federal Reserve gold bars up in New York. And this money was then, after it had been laundered, as they do in the City of London now, as we were hearing, was invested into all these businesses. And so that's why I think this is an important book, because Manning was a CBS News correspondent during World War II. If you read the book, you'll see he and 4 or 5 other correspondents were handpicked to go actually on bombing missions over Germany. So they could report back, if they managed to survive, the next day on the news to the whole of the United States, to let people know in America on the radio what it was like, what was going on in Europe. So they were quite plucky characters, and Manning was not happy when he realised that all this looted money from the war had been virtually ignored. Now, why, I'm going to throw this question out, why was it ignored virtually by Britain, by America? If they knew, they had intelligence reports that all this money was in South America, why did they ignore it? So any ideas? Huh?
Someone online has to benefit. Would it be for the Troika? The European monarchy, the Vatican and the bankers?
Not at that point. I mean, we're talking about the late 40s, early 50s, remember? Okay? They had the intelligence that this was going on in South America, but they ignored it. And the reason was, the threat at that time was the Russians. Okay? And they wanted to work with ex-Nazis who had been working in Eastern Europe to fight the Russians. And so there was a blind eye turned to it by Britain, by the United States at the highest levels. So they were saying, well, yes, we know these Nazis, yes, but we won the war, so let's sort of, be nice to them. And so let's just leave it as it is, Let's not cause too much of a fuss, because some of these Nazis are really being helpful and they've got good information on the Russians, who are our big threat now. In fact, Reinhard Gehlen, who was one of the heads of the Gestapo in the Second World War, was actually then made the head of the German Secret Service, officially. Now, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I don't know if anyone noticed, Heinz Fromm, who's the head of the German Secret Service, was, up until 3 or 4 weeks ago, resigned because it was proved that he was helping neo-Nazi groups right now in Germany. So this Nazi thread has not gone away, right? It's under the surface in business and also in terrorist attacks in Germany, which, and by the way, that neo-Nazi group, that Heinz Fromm, who's thankfully been sacked, I mean, it'd be nice if we could see the same kind of courage from our government, sacking far-right people who are in our security services, for example, but they don't. They do in Germany. And that group was also involved in the Munich Olympics, the murder of Israelis. Now, it all starts to get a bit weird, doesn't it? Because it was blamed on Palestinians at the time in the Munich Olympics. I think it was 72. But it turns out that this neo-Nazi group that Heinz Fromm has been helping also took part in that attack on the Israelis. So interesting that the Nazis were still around in the 70s killing Jewish people. And yet that was kind of swept under the carpet and it was blamed on the Palestinians. Now, I think it's very unwise of the Israeli state, for example, at these current Olympics that are going on right now, to start talking about the Munich, right? Because as soon as you start looking into Munich, you see there's a whole can of worms there. Do you really want to talk about that? Anyway, so getting back to Bormann and the Nazis over in South America, the whole point of that operation by Paul Manning and the book was to point out this threat, this financial threat, which nobody else was really doing. He used his own money to write the book, right? There was no publisher helping him, he spent 2 years of his life working on it. And I think if you ever get round to reading it, you'll find it's a terrific read as well, because you can see that the guy he's a basically proper journalist who's lived through the war, survived bombing missions over Germany, etc. And he's decided, right, okay, I'm going to write this. Now, the nice thing about the book is it's free. It's available as a PDF. If you want to buy an actual real copy of the book from the 1980s when it was first published, that costs about 100 quid, something like that. Sometimes there was another copy I saw online a few days ago for 400 quid. But you can get a PDF of it. His first son was shot in the head a few weeks after the book was published in New York. No apparent reason. Bang, dead. His publisher had his legs broken. So it does indicate it might be worth reading the book. So anyway, fast forward a little bit to the 60s, and as I said, the British and the Americans had given up on any idea of pursuing Nazi war criminals, right? It was like Nuremberg's gone, but there was one organisation that hadn't. Do you know who that was? The Mossad. The Israeli Mossad had a team over there led by a guy called Issa Harel, who himself had been actually a kind of Jewish terrorist, overthrowing British rule. But he was absolutely clear. Now we've made a bit of space in Israel, our job is to go and hunt down some of these war criminals. And they were. They were sneaking around South America, cataloguing these people, having a chat to people. And one of the ways that what he managed to do is he identified several people, including Bormann, as living there. And one of the key people was that there was a lot of pressure in Israel for them to find was the guy from Auschwitz who was the doctor, notorious doctor, Adolf Eichmann. Now, there's Dr. Mengele, sorry. Mengele was there. Eichmann was also there, who was one of the people who was a key person in this whole sort of final solution to kill all the Jews and made this a massive thing. Anyway, they actually managed to kidnap Adolf Eichmann. They found him, kidnapped him, put him on a plane at Buenos Aires airport. And then they thought, well, we've got him in handcuffs on this plane. Before we take off, shall we see if we can find any more of these war criminals? And they actually had tracked down Bormann and Mengele. And so they went to this boarding house where they thought they were, this Mossad team, knocked on the door. Oh, we're sorry that they went a couple of days ago. So they realised, oh, we've missed them. So they just flew off with Adolf Eichmann to Jerusalem, having obviously, you know, sort of slightly annoyed the Argentinians. But there's a big German expat community over in South America, particularly in Patagonia. So there was a lot of support for these ex-Nazis there. And when they got to Jerusalem, Eichmann was put on trial and executed. Now, when that happened, there was a sort of shockwaves going around the world, right? We neglected this guy. The Mossad have now got him, and he's now been executed. Why didn't we do it? There were all sorts of questions being asked right around the world. But the most important question, which was actually came from the Bormann network itself, which was, if you carry on this escapade, Israel, we will cut off financial support for your nice new country. Right, this is in the 1960s. Israel was still getting bigger and bigger. Yeah? And so basically money talks, yeah? And Nazi money talks. And Nazi money can even buy the Israeli or Jewish leadership. So they're saying to themselves, well, we can't really survive if we haven't got this money coming into the country, we really need it. Oh, okay. Oh, well, you know, let's just go the same way the Brits and the Americans have gone and forget about it. So he was the last guy that was, and Issa Harel was then sacked on some other pretext. So that was the point, really, I think. It's interesting to identify where Israel as a nation lost its soul, really. So they had decided, well, I'll tell you what, we're the government. It might be hassle for us if we continue following these very wealthy war criminals. And I suppose the other thing about all this is the film, which you can also watch online. It's one of these old World in Action films about Joseph Mengele. Because it's very clear there that he was basically the doctor who was looking after all these war criminals. So if one of them got ill, needed an injection or whatever, they'd go to Mengele. And what John Ware and his team did was a brilliant bit of investigative journalism. I mean, this stuff I get excited about. It's so sad. I'm afraid that's what I'm like. But what they did is they got a nice-looking blonde German woman, and with nice curly hair, and she was with another woman who had a hidden camera in a bag. And what they were doing then was going around Buenos Aires, finding all these ex-Nazis, and this blonde woman would say to them, "Oh yeah, I'm a big supporter of the SS, and I'm being hassled," and come up with a whole story. Right, and because of course she was like a honey trap, really, and all these Nazis were going, "Oh, she's nice," and "Oh, she needs my help," and they were chatting to her in bars and pubs, but she had a hidden microphone, and the woman who was on the other side of the room was filming the whole time with her just out of camera, so you can just about see her golden locks occasionally. But it's a brilliant bit of filming, and some of the people that she films are pretty hideous characters too. One of them, for example, going on about, "Oh, I see all these disabled people around Buenos Aires, they make me sick. We've got to get rid of them. What are they still doing, these disgusting people?" And so you can see that there was this whole, basically eugenics, master race, Nazi mentality was very much alive and well in this Bormann network and in South America, right up until the 70s when this was filmed, this John Ware documentary. And this is why I say, look at the financial networks today. Right? And we have to question. I mean, it's very difficult to make exact links, although there's loads of clues in the Manning book when he talks about specific companies which were invested with this Nazi money. But it's quite clear that that kind of cult mentality and criminality is still very much alive in places like the City of London today. Okay, over the last few weeks we've seen the LIBOR scandal with Barclays. Now that scandal is really high-level criminality, massive crime going on. We're talking about billions of pounds being robbed from people, from their basically charging them too much for their mortgages, taking a little bit out of all these people who've got loans every month. Now, it's not just mortgages, that the LIBOR rate is used for all sorts of other loans as well, for example, business loans, right? So almost everybody that's got a loan is affected by that rate in one way or another. It's the key rate which is used. So as they're messing about with the rate, they're stealing from literally thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, or even millions of people every day. And the actual amount involved over 20 years or so, maybe 10, 15 years, is colossal. So it's basically a criminal world, the City of London. I mean, many of us know this, but it's nice to have all the details from this LIBOR scandal, for example. And also, in the US, there's a class action that started against Barclays, for fixing the rate because we have lost all this money. Great, it's good to see that sort of thing happening, but quite how far it's going to go. The other thing, of course, is this HSBC thing 2 weeks ago, where the US Congress, funnily enough, right, and this is one of those things that really entertains me when you see the timing of these revelations, is you've got the last Prime Minister's question time, like literally like a day or two after the very last one before the summer break, out comes all this information in Congress. A congressional inquiry has discovered that HSBC has been laundering massive numbers of billions of dollars for the Mexican drug cartels. Now, that would all be all very well if these people were then immediately arrested who've been doing this, but they're not. And in fact, all that happened was the chairman, does anyone know who the chairman of HSBC was at the time of this, which was something like 7 or 8 years ago, where these Mexican drug cartels, it's in 2008, basically what happened is the financial system was starting to collapse. And HSBC said, oh, we need cash. And the Mexican drug cartels go, oh, we got cash. Here we got lots of cash. So they opened accounts for the Mexican drug cartels. Now, these drug cartels are really, I mean, seriously dangerous people, right? They leave piles of 60, 70 bodies by the side of the road because someone's looked at them the wrong way. And yet, HSBC is quite happy to open a bank account for them. So what are we dealing with when we're dealing with HSBC? So yeah, who was in charge of HSBC at the time? Well, it was a guy called Lord Green, who is right now a government minister. And you know what, last week, he said nothing about it for, I think it was about 10 days. He refused to comment, and then he came on somewhere like Channel 4 News and said sorry. But he's still in his job as a government minister. Right, we have a criminal government. These people are serious criminals, like some of the most criminal people in the world. Okay, we've got a government of millionaires as well. David Cameron made a fuss about Jimmy Carr. Does everyone remember that? Yeah, saying, oh, Jimmy Carr's got his money abroad. Where is it? I'm not sure quite. We're Cayman Islands or something. Jimmy Carr, quite rightly, look, I mean, you know, my own feeling is, well, I don't really mind about that, personally. I mean, so long as, yeah, exactly, you're getting something for your money, aren't you? Which is the opposite than with David Cameron. So Cameron brings this subject up. I mean, the principle being, it should not be within the law to take all of your wealth, put it abroad, so none of it is taxed, right? That's a basic fact. It should be taxed. If you're a very wealthy person and you're living in Britain, then they should be able to tax you based on your wealth here. Simple. So the law needs changing. Jimmy Carr doesn't need telling off. The law needs changing. And who is in a position to do that? Cameron isn't in a position to change the law. Jimmy Carr isn't, right? So first of all, he's made a big mistake. Second big mistake he made is that Ian Cameron, David Cameron's dad, when Mrs. Thatcher, in the early 1980s, relaxed exchange controls, was a pioneer of using tax havens. He got his money within months of this happening. His personal wealth was all in Panama and the Cayman Islands within months, back in the early 1980s, when these exchange controls were first released. So Cameron is no one to lecture anybody on the use of tax havens, since his dad was one of the main pioneers of the use of tax havens. So, yeah, we've got basically bullshitters, liars, and criminals. I mean, that isn't a criminal offence, but it is total hypocrisy for him to criticise Jimmy Carr, since his entire wealth. I mean, he at the time of the last budget, when it was quite clear that the budget was designed to help the millionaires in the cabinet, there was a little noise where the government was saying, hey, well, maybe we should disclose the tax details of the people in the cabinet. But then nothing's been heard of that since. Like many other things, they make a little squeak about it and then you never hear any more. So we've got a weird situation going on where if you've got a criminal cabinet, right, you've got criminals in your cabinet, I mean serious, some of the biggest criminals in the world in your central government, what they're doing is they're in a very much a dangerous state, right, because they know they're criminals, a bit like Egypt, right? What happened with, what's his name? Mubarak, right? His regime was stuck, when the Arab Spring happened, his interior minister, in fact just before the Arab Spring, sent a load of police with bombs down to Alexandria, to the Coptic Christian cathedral in Alexandria, and blew up loads of, well, several bombs in the cathedral, killing loads of people, right? The idea being to blame it on the Islamics, right? So that the Christians would start killing Islam. I mean, this is what despots of the world love, is all good people, or, you know, various ordinary people being divided into factions, murdering each other. Yeah, they love to see that, because then they're not thinking, it's divide and rule. They're not thinking about killing the cabinet, like, you know, hanging them from the lamp posts or anything like that. And the trouble with that whole scenario is you've got a situation with someone who's a very powerful person doing criminal acts to keep themselves in power, as Mubarak was, and then they're in a situation where, oh no, if we get found out and if someone else comes to power, we might go to jail. At the moment we're safe because we're in charge. So you get this whole kind of cult mentality really thickens up, and they have an absolute wall of secrecy, and they know that they have to continue with various types of criminality in order to stay in power and to stop someone else coming into power who might lock them up. So we've got a really kind of dodgy situation starting to build up now. I mean, that's happened in the United States for probably since the Kennedy assassination, but it's also really taking a grip here now too. So, you know, dangerous separation really between this whole illusion of we're spreading democracy around the world and what's actually going on is we have an elected dictatorship in Britain. So we elect some people by some sort of PR con who are hypnotised, you know. Basically, they tell people exactly what they want to hear, they know what they want to hear, and they tell them that, and then they do something completely different. The good thing about it all is that we've got quite a radicalised younger generation at the moment who are young people, many of whom believed Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats. They thought, oh, what, you know, we don't like Labour, we don't like Tory, but these Lib Democrats in. A lot of people who voted for the first time did vote for the Lib Dems. And then they found, oh, this whole business of tuition fees, they conned us, right? So they've got a really, you know, a pretty sharp political lesson there at a very early age. This democracy is a con. In fact, what happened was Cameron and Clegg did a deal before the election, so they were always going to massively put up the tuition fees when they got into the coalition government. So all this stuff that Clegg was saying about we're going to abolish tuition fees before the election was just a total lie. Okay, so that's just a sort of brief introduction to, I think, the general. I mean, the thing is, I think it's important to look at, and I don't know if I don't want to bore you folks, but to look at the general context of everything that's going on, and looking at it as a whole. So historically and today, because I think what happens in most of the media is they zoom in on one little issue, they'll look at it in detail. Sometimes they'll miss a major part of it, but they don't put it into context. So you'll see a little tiny bit. Say, for example, a strike. There'll be something on the telly about the strike, or the radio, or in the paper, and it will say something about, for example, the effects of the strike. Right? You won't get anything about the origins and the actual cause. You'll see an analysis of the symptoms, and this is not because there's no good journalists out there. It's because the media is virtually controlled by the managers and the editors. They're the people who tell the journalists what to write about. I mean, I've worked under these people. Some of them, back when I was working full-time in the early 1990s, were good people. You know, you felt great working for them because you knew that they were trying to do their job for the public. But nowadays, that's very difficult to find such types. Most of them have been weeded out by the system. And most of these editors and managers are, you know, kind of creepy characters that operate behind the scenes. Like, you'd never see them on the TV, you know. They're the ones that decide who goes on the TV or who the producer is, all this kind of thing. And there's basically a dumbed down type of situation. So what's wrong? Well, let's look at some of the real nuts and bolts of why this is, how we've got into this mess. The Bormann network I've talked about, and the book, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. But, I mean, what's also very powerful today is this whole kind of shadow government, right? Almost every aspect of government has got some kind of private club, which is like run by some foundation somewhere, that is doing the same job as that government department. And we've got loads of think tanks, right? A lot of them, you have to ask the question, where's the money coming from for them? Is it from some part of the Bormann network, you know? Or is it, where is the money coming from for a particular think tank? There's one called Policy Exchange, for example. which is a really, you know, it has to be described as far right. I mean, you know, some of the people involved in it were, these are orange men from Northern Ireland, these kind of characters running a think tank. And one of the reports they came out with 2 or 3 years ago was about Islamic radical books being sold in bookshops, basically saying, you know, jihad, blow up the West, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it turned out, Newsnight did actually a rare, really good report on this. It turned out that this thing which had gone all around the news, right, for the most of that week, and then on Newsnight, I think it was on the Thursday, shock announcement, the whole thing's a forgery. Right, so this story had gone 10 times around the world in all English language press, translated into all sorts of different languages by the wire services, Reuters and Associated Press, all these people, about these Islamic radical books being available. Newsnight had a look at the evidence and they said, hang on a minute, that's been printed out on a inkjet printer, that's not a proper receipt. And it turned out also that some of the receipts had been very clearly forged because they had the wrong address for the place on. Now, this is in order to control the news. And yet, there was really the only report I saw, I mean, and maybe there are others, 1 or 2, still, we were left with a legacy of 95% of the reporting on that story about the radical books being for sale was a total lie. There was 5% of it which told you that that report had been fabricated. And also, Policy Exchange are still quoted regularly as a credible source, even though they've been shown to have spent a great deal of time and money manufacturing a complete lie. I mean, they went to these radical bookshops and said, let's have a look. They showed you, oh, no, these are our receipts, completely different to that one. And anyway, the address is different. Look. So they actually, and it's only big organisations like Newsnight that have got the resources to go and check those sorts of things. Nowadays, whether they would is another question. Difficult to know. So one of the most important things, obviously, at the moment is foreign policy and the Foreign Office. Now, for years and years, you know, they have been in charge of all foreign policy. Nowadays, they've got this kind of limpet organisation, which is on the side of the Foreign Office, which is actually far more powerful than the Foreign Office, which is a private club which decides on what our foreign policy is going to be. And they have 2 journals. One of them is a sort of tabloidy journal for people who are sort of vaguely interested and kids maybe. And the other one is a very highbrow looking, like more of a broadsheets type of journal. Now, does anyone know what that organisation is called? It's a private club that virtually decides what British foreign policy is going to be, organises conferences all the way through the year and says we've got to attack Iran, this kind of thing.
Is this a Zionist?
Well, there are Zionists among it, but it's, yeah. Chatham House, Royal Institute for International Affairs. Now, the same exact type of organisation exists. I mean, the thing is, the scary thing about these types of organisations is they are far better funded than the Foreign Office are. They've got absolutely oodles of money. For example, during the Iraq War, if you remember, there was a junior lawyer at the Foreign Office who raised her hand. She said, I think this war might be illegal. I can't remember her name. Anyway, I noticed that she was immediately elbowed out. No, we can't have this. Yeah? And she immediately was given a very important job at the Royal Institute for International Affairs, where we can keep an eye on her. So that's the way these kind of organisations operate. They're very arrogant, they're incredibly cash rich. And in a way, you can almost today see how bad an organisation is by how rich it is. Now that might sound a terrible, hypocritical thing to say, but the money always seems to go where the organisations are that are doing what the global elite want rather than ordinary people, because there's a complete diametric opposite interest, right? What's good for us is that we've got some control over our lives and that we have our own culture maybe we have a mixed culture with other people who are living around us, but that we have a fairly local decision making, right? What's good for them is they want one king of the world deciding everything. For example, the EU is absolutely wonderful from their point of view. This is the global elite I'm talking about, the super rich. I'm not talking about the 1%, I'm talking about the 0.0001%. The handful of people who are so rich that they bought all of the houses, yachts, that they could ever wish for. They've got 20 yachts, they've got 20 houses. What do they then want? They've, okay, and 100 prostitutes. They've got all these things that they ever want. And they've got, what am I going to do with my money? Right, buy newspapers. Let's buy influence. Let's buy power. Buy political parties. Go and do a little deal quietly with one of the party treasurers and say, look, I want this law passed, and I'll give you, 2 or 3 million if you do it. So that's the sort of realm we're in now, is where money is so corrupted, and funnily enough, we haven't got enough money to keep our daycare centres open in Bristol. We haven't got enough money to look after our old people. I don't know if people saw the protest last week at the City Council when they made a decision about closing all these care homes. Massive protest outside the City Council of all these people that care about what happens to elderly people, and they think that society has a duty to look after somebody who can hardly walk, can't do their own shopping. So where has all this money gone? It's gone to tax havens and it's gone to the global elite. So just before I get off the subject of the EU, I think we've got to be really clear about what this organisation is. It is utterly elitist. I mean, if you look at the people who have been the European commissioners, who officially are basically the government of Europe, none of them have ever been elected. In fact, every single one has been rejected by the people for one reason or another. People like Peter Mandelson, who was an EU commissioner. He's someone who was very clearly corrupt. I think it was 3 times a record that he got kicked out of government because it was proven that he'd lied on various occasions. And yet he's perfect to be a European commissioner, an EU commissioner. The same with Chris Patton, who people may remember in Bath, was kicked out. People of Bath said, well, this guy's an idiot, we don't want him as an MP. Well, of course, let's put him right at the very top then, at the European Union. Now, the EU does things like, I mean, obviously taxes the whole of Europe. It makes decisions like whether or not there's going to be sanctions against Iran, for example. It makes decisions like how much cap subsidy is the Queen going to get? As if she's not rich enough, we're going to give her another maybe £500,000 a year as a common agricultural policy, agriculture subsidy for her land she's got and for the crops she's producing, because we want to pat her on the back for being such a wonderful person and growing lots of food for us. Now, the Queen does not need a cap subsidy, but the EU gives her a cap subsidy anyway. And of course, if you're a small farmer, for really small farmers, it's hardly even worth all the time it takes to do the paperwork for the cap subsidy to get it. So this is another thing that favours the big guys and doesn't, and basically sidelines the little guys. And again, it means that what's happening in our agriculture is that it pays to conglomerate. Yeah. So a big estate there, let's just mix it with that big estate there. We've only got one lot of administration to do, we get double the money. Fantastic solution. So this is another thing that the EU's up to. I mean, there is a whole list of things you could go on for a long time about the European Union. Most important is that none of these people are elected, of course. Catherine Ashton, who's just put the sanctions on Iran, I mean, unbelievable really. She used to be the treasurer of CND years ago. I mean, she's never been elected to any office. She was made a lord, put into the House of Lords, and then suddenly she's the foreign minister for the whole of Europe. Never been elected in her life. And when she was the treasurer of CND, the question's got to be, was she spying for MI5 when she was in CND? I mean, CND was a major target, of course, back in the 1980s. All sorts of government agencies had spies within CND. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament was considered to be a threat to national security, and they could justify spending millions on infiltrating it. So, who is this woman, Catherine Ashton? Every time I see her on the TV, I point at the TV, who are you? To be saying all this stuff. So it's quite clear that the EU is not a democratic organisation. Then there's this organisation which I've looked into called the Bilderbergs, and this is where we get back to the Nazis. Now, how many people here have heard of the Bilderbergs? Most of you, have you? Yeah? Maybe. All right, well, just to start at the beginning, we heard earlier on I was talking about this Martin Bormann network. Now, that started at a specific, you can actually nail down the exact date and time that this Bormann network was born, right? Which was when the Nazis realised they were going to lose the Second World War. Anyone that knows anything about the history, there was a battle after D-Day, right? I mean, Hitler was convinced that when the Allies landed in Europe, that he was going to be able to beat them back. And he did a pretty good job, actually, in beating back the Allies. I mean, they'd got their foothold in Normandy, but it wasn't at all clear if they were going to be able to spread right across Europe from that one point, because the Nazis had held on to many of the ports, like including Antwerp, was a very important port. The Nazis were hanging on for grim death to that, and they weren't letting any supplies through. So the Allied armies had to rely on a very small, narrow supply line. And Hitler was quite sensibly, and his people were attacking that supply line, bombing it from the air, this kind of thing. Although they didn't have air superiority, they could still stop a lot of the ammunition and stuff getting up to the front. So this was an important battle. Anyway, there was one battle called the Falaise Gap Battle, which was basically where the Nazis, what they tried to do was to stop a particular bit of advance, and they completely failed in this, and the Allies just rolled over the top of them. At which point, anyone who was a serious military contender in Nazi Germany in 1944 thought, right, well, there's no way we're going to roll back now, because this army's coming to Berlin. It's just a matter of time. So they then sat down, and Bormann convened this meeting in Strasbourg, which was still in Nazi hands, of loads of top industrialists, called the Red House meeting. Now, at that meeting were all the top people, Krupps, Volkswagen, all the big manufacturing industries of Nazi Germany, and they were all part of this plan, right? So the idea being that, when you're on board with this plan, what we're doing is we're getting any of your securities you need getting out, give them to Bormann, blah, blah, blah. So the whole system started on the 10th of August at the Red House Hotel, the Maison Rouge Hotel in Strasbourg. Now, this was actually in the Daily Mail, believe it or not, about 2 years ago. I opened it up, I thought, blimey, this is there was a copy of the US intelligence report, because the Americans had been spying on the meeting. The Brits hadn't for some reason, but anyway, the Americans knew all about it. And there's this intelligence report. I just couldn't believe my eyes. Wow, the Red House intelligence report in the Daily Mail. Just a copy of the top of it said top secret on it, which is, it's quite heartening to see that there, because this is, if we understand that the Nazi thing did not die off, that it just changed its chameleon-like shape to something different, then it helps us understand what's going on today. So anyway, from that meeting, there were other things going on too, right? So we've got a plan to really dominate Europe, right? We talked a little bit about that Bormann network as well, but there was a sort of two-pronged thing. There was a Yalta agreement with Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. We basically divided up. This is in 1943 or 44. I'm not quite sure which, but anyway, towards the end of the war. Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill all got together and said, basically, they drew a line through the middle of Europe, through Poland, right, which the Poles actually didn't really want to be part of the Russians. I mean, they'd been massacred by the Russians in the run-up to the Second World War. They were very much keen on being part of Europe and the West rather than the East. But oh no, Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt carved it up so the Poles were going to go with the East. And the leader of the Poles, who was General Sikorski, he was a leader in exile living in Britain during the war, was really annoyed about this, because he's like, look, I'm supposed to be the leader. You can't just tell me I'm going to go with the Russians when I want to go with the Brits. So anyway, he then died in a mysterious plane crash off Gibraltar. And his personal aide was a guy called Joseph Rettinger. Now, Rettinger was working for MI6. He was with Sikorski, the Polish leader in exile, General Sikorski. And one of the first ever trips that Sikorski took without Rettinger was this one where the plane crashed and he died. So Rettinger's got a little bit of a suspect character. Anyway, he was involved in setting up this Bilderberg organization along with another chap called Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Right, Bernhard is called Bernhard of the Netherlands, even though he's German. He married into the Dutch royal family about 1937, just before the war. And even though he was trumpeting throughout the war, because he could speak Dutch, he had a crash course in Dutch, right? He was sporting his Dutch credentials. Actually, he was a German. And also, he'd been in the SS before the war. And when he was at college, he'd been one of the first members of the original Nazi party, right? He was an enthusiastic Nazi. And yet he was trying to go through the war saying, I'm Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and the Dutch people, they love me. But actually, you're a Nazi, mate. Anyway, Prince Bernhard managed to get his security clearance in London, amazingly enough. because King George VI, who was the king during the war, ordered, well, not ordered, but told Ian Fleming, you know, the guy who wrote the Bond novels, he was in charge of security clearance in the war, or one of the people, and he signed Bernhard's little form saying this guy is a safe guy and we can trust him, right? Ian Fleming signed them because George VI asked him to. Now, you have to also sort of roll back slightly. George VI, right, his brother was Edward VIII, who abdicated with a Nazi spy, and they tried to get to, he was a Nazi, basically. He was a total Nazi. Very openly enthusiastic about the Nazi party, and so that's why he was kind of abdicated out of the way. Hang on, we can't have an enthusiastic Nazi king if we're going to fight a war with the Nazis. So he was shuffled off sideways. And John Loftus has written a lot about this. He was an FBI special investigator, special prosecutor appointed by Jimmy Carter to follow war criminals in the States. John Loftus wrote about this, and he explained that Edward and Mrs. Simpson actually tried in 1939 to they got to France and they tried to get across the front line into Nazi Germany. Thankfully, I mean, this is not known to very many people. Thankfully, MI6 were sort of keeping an eye on them, and they arrested them right before they got to the no man's land, because they were trying to drive literally into Nazi Germany, and they'd arranged it with the Germans to be there and collect them. Now, imagine what that would have been like if we'd have had a former king and the brother of the existing king, George VI, broadcasting all over Europe throughout the war about how wonderful the Nazis were on the radio, like Lord Haw or whatever. So anyway, MI6 arrested him, and that's why he spent the war in Bermuda, right, as the governor of Bermuda, because they wanted him out of the way. We're not having you going over to the Nazi side. Thank you very much, king, ex-king. So, you know, there also got to be questions about George VI and what was his real loyalty. I mean, yeah, I think many people know that Prince Philip was also, his cousins were enthusiastic Nazis. He spent a lot of time with Nazis in his younger years. And, you know, there's a lot of connections between the royal family and this kind of cult type, master race, you know, racist mentality, which I think is still there very much in parts of the royal family. Anyway, they certainly don't like Muslims, that's for one thing. But anyway, okay, so you've got this guy, Prince Bernhard. He was then approved by Ian Fleming and by the king to work with the army. Okay, so he was in on the planning of loads of stuff at the end of the Second World War, which is really rather dangerous for our troops, right? Okay, they may not have had low-level spies, but if you can have one spy up in Whitehall who's watching all the plans, as the generals like Montgomery are talking stuff through, and you've got a spy who's watching it all, that's rather handy, isn't it? And Bernhard, I mean, it's very difficult to actually prove these things, but he's got all the characteristics of a Nazi. He lied throughout his, I mean, this is literally only since he died a few years ago has this come out in the press in Holland, how much he lied. Loads of stuff that people thought about their Prince Bernhard, who was their sort of head of state, basically. Well, actually, it's Queen Juliana who was the head of state, and he was married to her. So he was like Prince Philip kind of thing over there. And loads of stuff that people had heard about him was complete fabrications. There's books and articles out in Holland now explaining this guy was just a bullshitter right the way through. And as I said, he was an enthusiastic Nazi. He said he always denied ever being a Nazi, right? But he was in the SS. Come on, mate, please. So Bernhard and Rettinger were the two people that really started the Bilderbergs off in the 1950s. And this is really where this Bormann network, I would argue, the financial network meets politics, because they basically bring in politicians who are in the stages of becoming leaders of the opposition party look like they may come to power. They're brought along to these Bilderberg meetings, and it's a kind of, let's check them out. Do they look like they're the right sort of people for the job? Can we get them on board with this massive sort of financial power network? And I mean, it is rather worrying that this whole thing was chaired by Bernhard for 20 years, from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, who was a Nazi and a liar. So he got kicked out in 1975 because of something older people amongst us might remember called the Lockheed scandal, where a chambermaid found a note in his in his bin in his hotel room, which proved, basically, I don't know, even names on it or something, and it was printed in the Dutch press that he'd taken a bribe of $1 million from Lockheed to buy Lockheed's aircraft for the Dutch government. And they did buy these aircraft, and they're starfighters. They were rubbish aeroplanes, and they just kept falling out of the sky. But that didn't matter, because Bernhard had got his million, and as a result, he was then no longer credible to be the chair of the Bilderbergs. But various other people had taken over, Lord Carrington, etc. So, I think it's pretty clear to me we've got a well-organised criminal cult-based network in. I wouldn't say in charge, because they think they're in charge. They're not in charge of this place, for example. They have great delusions of power through money, and they want to own everything. Which I suppose is when I come to this partly, right? Who owns? Has anyone seen this before? It's a book called Who Owns the World? Now, isn't it interesting that someone would even sit down and think to write such a book? I think it's fascinating, because a lot of this is about ownership. I own this. This is mine. First of all, who is so arrogant to think that they own the world or they own a county? To me, you cannot own the earth. You have to have some kind of. You've either made it. You can own a car. You can own a book, right? That can be your book. That can be your car. But your county, your country. This is starting to get into the realms of like crazy fantasy. Because this is a free gift to the whole of mankind, not just to you. Everybody needs to use land, everybody. And one of the major landowners of the entire planet, you'll see if you ever get hold of this. I mean, Kevin Carhill's used to work for, he still does actually work for the Sunday Times Rich List. And one of the reasons he wrote the book is because he found that when you're compiling these rich lists, it was complete fantasy, basically. Because if people kept their money offshore, they're not on the list. Yeah. Also, land holdings. They can own loads of land in Britain, but it's very difficult to know how much they own. And if you don't know how much land they own, you don't know how wealthy they are. And for anyone that knows about the land registry, you can ask at the land registry, how much does this person own? But unless that land has changed hands in the last approximately 60 years, they won't tell you anything because there's no register there. Right? It's only when the land changes hands that you are legally obliged to register the ownership of it. So, funnily enough, the only way to discover who owns most of the land in Britain still is to guess how you find out. Come on. Well, in a way, exactly, yeah. You've just got to squat it. If you squat a piece of land, you will then get a piece of paper through the post with the deeds of the alleged landowner. Right? And isn't that a bizarre situation to be in, where you can't actually find out who owns a piece of land unless you actually start living on it? Amazing, crazy situation to be in. I mean, it's actually a very good thing, I think, squatting. I mean, I'm a big fan of squatters, and I've squatted myself. But, we're in a situation where, historically, through something called enclosure, privatisation of land, over centuries, mostly since the English Civil War in the 1600s, we've been cheated of our land, right? Because the Parliament, up until the suffragettes, the extension of the franchise, well, the suffragettes basically, yeah. It was either just men or landowners that could vote even for MPs. So these MPs were basically voting themselves the land. They were passing little private acts of Parliament to privatise bits of land. I've just been up in Stroud today to Minchinhampton and Rodborough Commons. Nobody actually owns that land. It's common land. Well, it is owned by the Lord of the Manor, but he can't just do what he wants with it. He's got to go through the local Commons Committee if he wants to do something. And also, he can't build on it. No, because it says here you're not allowed to build on it. You can graze cattle, mate, but you can't build on it. So that's the way we used to manage land collectively. A city like Bristol is not really the same as the old rural society used to be, because here it's complicated and different. But in the old days, villages were basically run collectively with the Lord of the Manor in the top seat, but the Lord of the Manor would often be fined. For example, say his cows went into someone else's field and started, eating their crops. The Lord of the Manor was just like anyone else. He would be fined for that by the committee. And so we used to manage our rural land collectively. And that's what enclosure squashed, because it took all that collective ownership and it gave it to one person. And that's why we're in a situation in Bristol, right? Does anyone know how many homeless people there are in Bristol?
It's supposed to be the highest area in England, no?
I don't know, actually, how it compares to other places. I do know, though, the official figures, the number of people on the housing list in Bristol is 15,000. And there's at least another 5,000 who aren't on the list, who are homeless. Now, we're talking about people who are sofa surfing, all sorts of things, right? But it's a massive problem. It's the biggest problem, I would say, I would suggest, social problem in the country, is people who don't have anywhere to live, or who are, I mean, this is basically a landowner's charter, which is to make a massive scarcity of places to live so they can jack up the price. Now, look at our offices, for example, in the city. We've got now a guy called Tony Crofts, who's from a Clifton housing co-op, made a phone call to Savills estate agents recently and found out we've got a roughly 15 million square feet of empty office space in Bristol. 15 million square feet, right? So that is the equivalent. He's a bit of a number cruncher, and he worked out that's about 40,000 houses worth of space, right? Okay, so we've solved the housing problem overnight. We convert these offices to living accommodation. We don't have any homeless people at all. Everyone's got somewhere to live. So the other side of that is, okay, maybe we don't want to convert all those offices to houses. What about just converting them to offices that are being used? Right? We've got all these people unemployed. We've got lots of people who need space to work in, would love a low rent space for maybe no rent for a few months to get them going. And we've got all this empty office space. Why can't we put two and two together? Well, the answer is because these offices are not there as offices. They're there as investments in some business company balance sheet. And the prices are not a free market price for an office. It's a fixed price. Now, let's just let me try it again to ask you, what would happen if we did have a free market in the price of office space in Bristol? Well, the rents would go right down, wouldn't they? Right? All of a sudden, you'd be able to move to somewhere and you'd be paying a quarter of the rent probably, right? A lot of people would go for that, wouldn't they? I'd imagine many small businesses would love it. And it would be a massive boost to the economy because it's cutting loads of overheads from loads of businesses. So that's a capitalist market solution, right? If you're a real free marketeer, that's what you should be saying. Let's do that. And why doesn't it happen? Can you imagine why that doesn't happen? Certainly, I mean, I've talked to various people about this. The key reason that I've heard is because I think we don't get these issues discussed. You know what I mean? This is a massive city with all these resources. Let's just put two and two together and make it work. Why can't we do that? The reason we can't do that is because, say that's an office over there that's empty, and we've got, say the building's worth, let's just say, for example, with the land, £250,000 with the offices. Now, how do you make that valuation? You make that valuation by looking at the rent for that place if it was being rented out, okay? That's how a valuer will come along and say, oh yeah, these offices could be rented out for X amount. Now, what happens if those rents in the city start going down is the value of that building starts going down too. That value of that building may go down to £50,000. Oh dear. Now, suddenly on these businesses' balance sheets, what's going on those balance sheets? Exactly. Right? That company is now bust because the fixed assets on the balance sheet of that business are far less than its liabilities. Oh dear, so that company's bust. And that's one of the reasons why I think we're in this situation, is because businesses are allowed to value their property way over what it's actually really worth. So that may be on the books for 200,000, but if you try and sell it tomorrow for 200,000, forget it, right? But it's there on the books quite legally. Now this is a form of accounting fraud. And this is just another example of the sort of stuff that's been going on in the city. We heard earlier when I was talking about the, sort of criminals. Now, this is a formal situation in the City of London. It is run by criminals, right? And ever since 1992 it's been the case. There was Ian Fraser, is a city blogger, an analyst, and he reported a few weeks ago, fantastic, fascinating report, and it's stuff that he knows about because he was there at the time. 1992, he attended a court case in London, which was with one of the last big fraud cases called the County NetWest trial or Blue Arrow trial. Blue Arrow, some sort of employment agency which was floated on the stock market by this company called County NetWest, the bank called County NetWest. Now, by whatever shenanigans they did it, but the brokers at County NetWest massively overvalued the company to the, as has happened exactly with Facebook, right? Massively overvalued it. So they said, we reckon it's worth this much, investors, you know, invest in it, we reckon it's worth this much. Actually, it wasn't worth anything like that much. And so everyone had put their money into it, and like almost as soon as the thing was floated on the stock market, the share price went right down, massively down, and everyone lost loads of money on it, right? But they made loads of money. And they were put on trial. And this thing went on and on and on. This is these County NetWest people, the Blue Arrow trial, 1992. And eventually they were found guilty. It's about 4 of these brokers. And what happened? The judge handed down a suspended sentence. Right? Now, has anyone here ever had a suspended sentence? They're not admitting it, even if they have. Right. A suspended sentence is basically, naughty boy, don't do it again. Yeah? Yes. Loads and loads of time and effort for all this court case, blah, 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 and actually just please don't do it again. And if you do, we might consider putting you in jail. Now that was not enough, right? Because these guys, they take the mickey. They then went to the Court of Appeal saying, we don't like that. We think that we should have our convictions quashed by the Court of Appeal because we were honest brokers. And okay, so you know it was a big mistake, but anyway, the Court of Appeal, the crooked Court of Appeal, overturned those convictions. And when those convictions were overturned, the message went out across the city. Right? Look, guys, they got off. And in a way, it's rather like those sort of kind of Masonic ceremonies that we see. I don't know if people have ever seen these on YouTube, where they have basically like all your mates, Masonic mates are there, and we're all your mates, and if you do anything, we'll be there to protect you, doesn't matter what it is. It's the same kind of thing going on in the city, that you've got this massive network of cults, clandestine crooks and criminals who will protect you because you're one of them. And so since that 1992 trial, it's been absolute open season to do anything you want, at all. That includes defrauding your clients of any amount you wish, right? So that's okay. The other thing, of course, is money laundering. Any kind of money laundering you want to do in the city, absolutely fine. And most importantly, I think, personally, although you might find it boring, is accounting fraud, Enron accounting. Writing anything you want in those figures that you send to Companies House every year. Now, funnily enough, when we had the banking collapse in 2008, all these banks had been audited, right, by people like Deloitte and all these auditors, and they'd been given a clean bill of health. Oh, this is a healthy company, right? But suddenly in 2008, they're crying to the government on their knees saying, help, we're falling to pieces. And the government the Treasury is looking at their accounts and they're saying, hang on a minute, you've got healthy accounts, what's the problem? Oh, we haven't got any cash, we're about to collapse. Now, this is fraud. And these the auditing firms, I think it's the big 4 there are, Deloitte, Mazars or something, there are a whole bunch of them. They're now being investigated rather belatedly by the Competition Commission. You know, they're looking into, hang on a minute, it's collusion here, yeah? These auditors are cooking the books and the whole city is actually in a total mess. There's money being taken from all these businesses in corrupted ways, these banks. Now, over the last few weeks, we've also seen some problems, haven't we, with, what are they? They are RBS, Ulster Bank, Lloyds, I think. Well, I'm not sure about HSBC, but certainly, and last week it was again NatWest. People can't, oh hang on, a Nationwide Building Society too. Suddenly, we've had a system of computerised banking for about 40 years, but all of a sudden, oh dear, we're very sorry, but we've accidentally taken that money out of your account twice. Or you've gone to a cash point and it just says does not compute. Now, I don't trust these banks at all, right? When I see something like that, I think that's funny. 40 years it all worked fine, and now it's all started not working, and I can't have my money. Isn't that peculiar? Put into context some of the stuff I've been telling you about the criminality in the banking system. I think it's pretty clear that the banks are running out of cash. They don't want to give us the cash because they haven't necessarily got the cash. It's very easy for them to press a button on a screen and make up another digit money out of nowhere. But when it actually comes to having the cash to give you over the counter, oh dear, we haven't actually got the cash, sorry. Now, this is, I think we're living in that situation, teetering on the brink of a serious situation. Now, does anyone know anything about the banking collapse in Argentina in 2000? Because that is, I would suggest you all, if you don't do anything else from this talk, go and have a look at that, right, when you get home. Because in the year 2000, I think it was December, there was, I think they had, now, figures may be wrong, 3 presidents in 2 weeks, right? There was a complete collapse of their banking system. The IMF basically stepped into Argentina. Now, Argentina's not the most uncorrupt country anyway, when we know it's had fascist governments, etc., and possibly still does. Now, they had a situation there where people's life savings just went, just like that. So, for someone working all their life, for their old age, they've saved up a nest egg of equivalent in British terms of, say, 60 grand, something like that, just sitting in the bank. It's gone. The IMF have taken it. Overnight. Cash points just seized up overnight. Nothing. You're not going to get any money out of the banks. A bit like Northern Rock, but worse. There was no queue because there was no point. The bank was just shut. And that is essentially what we're looking at here, I think. So do have a look at what happened in Argentina. Basically, everyone came out on the streets with pots and pans, banging pots and pans. Oh, we need a new president. Anyway, so they got away with it. The IMF and the International Bankers got away with it. They got away with all that cash that people had saved for years. What it does do in that sort of situation, if you can see a positive side to it, is it brings communities together. People need then to rely on their neighbours more. They'll go next door and say, oh, we've got no food. Do you mind if we share a meal if you've got a little bit of water, whatever. People are much more, suddenly communities start to form that had been kind of not there in the past, and you get a very strong sense of collectivism. The human species is a funny creature when it's under pressure like that and under attack. And essentially we are under attack in Britain. We're under attack by our own coalition government. They are attacking the basic things that a civilised society needs. They're trying to roll us back to the Stone Age, doing what George Bush tried to do to Iraq, to us, but in a subtle way, to take away the very simple things that make life worth living. For example, I don't know if people know about Remploy here in Bristol. I've been doing some stuff about it on the radio, had some of these Remploy workers coming in, almost in tears. But we work really hard. We are disabled people. Our organisation was set up by Winston Churchill after World War II to provide some employment for people who had war injuries. And the idea is a small government subsidy, not a big government subsidy, but it gives us some guaranteed employment. Now, there's a very nice Remploy factory in Bristol. Funnily enough, they make money. They're one of the few in the country that have got a full order book. They've got as many people as they can employ. The government have said to them for the last 4 or 5 years they're not allowed to employ anybody else, any more people. They can only keep existing employees, which is totally ridiculous, right, for any business to be able to function. But anyway, the people who were there 4 or 5 years ago have stayed, right, and they're really dogged people, they want to stay there. The other thing is that employment doesn't only provide them with quality of life and personal, a kind of personal self-respect, yeah, and dignity. It also makes money. Now, the government have decided they're going to close it, right? So, if we cannot Now, I mean, just think about that for a minute. We had the Tory former mayor, Jeff Gollop, on the radio saying this makes no sense, does it? The coalition government are not doing any kind of joined up thinking. Because what's happening is one department who manages that budget has decided we don't want to pay this money for Remploy. Well, even though you're not actually paying any money to Bristol, they're paying you, right? So this to me is one of those fights I think, is worth fighting. Right? And a full order book as well, as much work as they can do, and they're making money. So how can you close that place down? Now, I think this really does smell of fascism. When I see good disabled people, for one other thing about going to work every day like that, as they do, is they get support from their fellow workers, say for example there's a clinic that helps with a particular type of disability, they can find out about it at work, right? It makes sense for them to be there. They're not being subsidised. What's going to happen if they all get sacked is they are all going to be on the dole. They're going to find it really difficult. They're going to be out there in the marketplace with everybody, able-bodied people. And this is why I say that we are under attack. I really do believe that. This government is not doing things for the good of the country. It's doing the things for the good of a private elite, international 0.001%, who want control of us. And also, I would argue, they have no interest in disabled people. Disabled people are basically useless. They are rejects, retards. That's the sort of mentality that the approach to Remploy in Bristol particularly, because it's a money-making concern, that's what it smacks of to me. I mean, in my own little way, I'm fighting back against this. One of the things that I decided to do is to identify councillors in this city. I mean, think global, act local, yeah? Identify councillors in this city who are slackers. I call them city slackers. People who've got elected to public office, but that don't return emails, don't return phone calls. Simple thing, isn't it, really? If you are elected to public office and somebody phones you up saying, would you like to come on the radio to talk about your views and do a weekly news review, as we do on the radio here, if I can plug my show, 5 till 7, 93.2 every Friday evening. If they can't reply to an email or a phone call requesting that they come on that radio show, I think they're letting the side down. I think they shouldn't be a councillor. Maybe they're in the wrong job. If you're a city councillor, you should be prepared to come in front of the public and give us your views. What are we voting for? We're not just voting for a party, we're voting for a person. By the way, in, is it Bradley Stoke? Oh, no. Westbury-on-Trim, Bradley Stoke, one of these places. Maybe someone can help me out here. There's been loads of Tory councillors defecting to UKIP. Right? I think it's 3 now, another one last week. Yes, I think it is Westbury-on-Trim. It's got its own little town council or something. So anyway, they have decided that the Tory government is attacking the people and they're not interested anymore. So in a way, it's a little bit like the Labour people who've peeled off to the Greens and to Respect. There are Tory people, honest Tories, who are peeling off to UKIP. Now a lot of people say, well some people anyway say, oh UKIP is just like the BNP or something. No, it's not. It's not, right? They're not like the BNP. In fact, there's a lot of people who are joining UKIP to try and basically pollute it and corrupt it to be like the BNP, to be a racist party. And they are basically desperate for support, and sometimes they take the wrong people, but they are basically an anti-EU sort of decent half of the old Tory party. And I've met a lot of these people. Some of them are a bit nutty, some of them are a bit over right wing, but they're basically not, they're the decent side of the Tory party seem to be doing this. So we've got a situation where it's useful and helpful to identify who it is that are the problem. And for me, the problem people are the people who just get elected and then they stay behind the scenes on, for example, planning committees, deciding on what's going to happen to this building, this kind of thing. I want people, anyone who's an elected politician, they should be out in front of the public. Now, as far as I'm concerned, isn't it easier for them to come down to our radio studio and sit and talk for an hour rather than go and put loads of little leaflets through people's letterboxes? Isn't that a bit easier? I mean, we've got this technology called radio. which was invented by this guy called Marconi, which is a lot easier than actual physical bits of paper through letterboxes. And anyway, how many people read that? How many more people are going to be listening to me cross-examining X, Y, and Z and asking them some awkward questions, like why are you getting rid of Remploy when they're making money? That doesn't make sense. Would you explain, please, Mr. Gollop? You're a Conservative. This is a Conservative government that's doing this. So what I'm trying to do in a way with the radio programme is to separate out the party from the individuals. And the city slackers is a big part of all that. And I'd just like to tell you who the city slackers are. I mean, I don't know if people here vote even, right? But, and in a way, it's a slightly unfair thing because there is, you know, there may be reasons why somebody doesn't reply to email. Maybe they're not very good with email, they're better on the phone. But I have tried both phone and email to get hold of all these people. The highest number, percentage, would anyone like to guess which party has the highest percentage of city slackers in Bristol? Labour? Any other guesses?
I'd say Liberals.
Liberals? No, you're all wrong. So far, it's the Tories. The Tories. I'll just run through them. Richard Eddy was the leader of the Tory party. He's got something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, right, where he was in intensive care for months, and he's now not able to answer phone calls, and he's able to, I get emails from him, but he can't come on the radio and he can't speak on the phone. So my question, it might sound a bit harsh, but is can you be a councillor if you cannot speak on the phone and you cannot come to the radio? If you want, I'll come and pick you up and bring you to the radio, right? What is going on with Richard Eddy? My suggestion, which I've made on the radio, is that maybe he should stand down and we should have a by-election and someone else can take over in Bishopsworth, right, because he's from Bishopsworth. The other thing is his colleague in Bishopsworth, who's also a Conservative, Kevin Quartley, he never replies to any emails either or phone calls. Not a single reply from him. These are the Tories then, because there's less of them. There's less actually in number, but the Tories are a smaller group, so the higher percentage of them are the slackers. We've also got Froome Vale James Stevenson, another councillor who doesn't reply to phone calls or emails. St George East, Alex Pearce. Don't know who the guy, what he even hardly looks like. No replies, again. And probably the most interesting from the Tory group is this guy, John Goulandris. Now, if any of you bother to go to a full council meeting, and they are quite entertaining concerns, I would actually say it's worth going, because you do get quite a lot of banter, you know, between the Labour people who often know what's going on and will put interesting questions to people at embarrassing moments. John Goulandris is one of the big players in the Conservative group. He's constantly skipping around various people in the group during the meetings. He's a former banker. He's also a city slacker. He doesn't reply to my phone calls. He doesn't reply to my emails. So that's the Tories. We've got also, and he's for Stoke Bishop. So St George East, Froome Vale, Bishopsworth, Stoke Bishop. It worries me. If I live, for example, in Windmill Hill, both of my councillors, because for each ward there are 2 councillors, both of them are city slackers. Mark Bailey and Alf Havoc. Mark Bailey and both of them have both said to me, I'm not really interested in doing that sort of thing. You know, so this is a way we can start identifying who are the people who have gone into politics to actually do something and maybe make the world a better place and have the front to come up to the public and speak like they would in the old days in public. If you basically, if before the days of TV and radio, if you didn't get up in public and come and speak to the people, there's no way you were going to get a vote. Because they voted because I saw him the other day, he was in the street, he was saying this, I thought he was good. A bit like a preacher kind of thing. And they vote for you. Nowadays, it's just a party. People vote much more for the party. And the party is the machine that does the marketing. You know, the marketing is all party marketing, so you're voting for a party, not a person. Okay, also in Redland, Sylvia Townsend, she's, you know, another slacker. Sean Emmett in Lockleys. This is all Lib Dems. Some more Lib Dems. Brislington West, Jackie Norman. Bev Knott from Bishopston. He actually just said, I don't do media. He's one of the cabinet members, right? He's making all these massive decisions about spending of millions of pounds of our money, but he doesn't do media. we've got Brislington West, Peter Main, Hillfields, Patrick Hassel. In Hallfield, again, both the Lib Dem councillors are city slackers. Cheryl Ann, who I've met several times, but she goes, oh, I just don't want to go on there. Yeah. Okay, fine. You know. But don't expect me to endorse you as a serious politician. Now, probably the most, in a way, explosive of these slackers is this guy, Peter Levy. Now, Peter Levy is a Lib Dem councillor for Hallfield. He's a former Ministry of Defence policeman. He's now standing as the Lib Dem candidate for the Police and Crime Commissioner, who's going to take over this man, allegedly, from the entire police authority to look after the public interest in the entire criminal, basically oversee the police, entire of Avon and Somerset Police, the whole force. Yet he can't return a phone call and he can't return an email, and he doesn't want to come on the radio and talk about it. So who is Peter Levy? That's what I want to know. And where is his loyalty? Incredible to think that someone who just doesn't want, I mean, maybe they think, and I say this, maybe they think that community radio is a waste of time. Maybe they do. And that's their right. But please don't ask me to say you're a serious politician if you can't come on the radio once in 3 years for an hour and talk about what you believe. Okay, so that's the Lib Dems. And then we've got a few more which are Labour. They've just got a handful, which is Philwood. Both the councillors in Philwood, Jeff Lovell and Chris Jackson, won't come on. And then also in Hillfields, Phil Hamby and Hengrove, Barry Clark are also city slackers. Now, it might seem a little bit harsh to do this kind of thing, but I think this is the information the public needs when it comes to an election time. Right? You may find that come a few months before an election, these people will be happy to come. But I don't care about that. I want them to be our politicians throughout that time. And I know for a fact that they've got all sorts of corporate lobbyists and big business and developers knocking on their door every single day, these people, saying we want to do this, we want to do that. And I want their priority to be us, not these people who are hassling them day after day. It's the same with the central government. They're getting lobbyists every day, telling them we want this law, we want that, blah, blah, blah. People who are paid to do it, like these private healthcare companies. But we need our politicians to be there for us right in between elections. Okay, so I think I'll just finish off by, that's my little thing I'm doing, okay? So it's just like everyone can do a little something, and that's my contribution, I think, to helping people to vote for somebody, actually use your vote, since people have fought for it for a long time, you may as well. And there are some very good councillors who will phone me up and say, oh, did you know this is going on? This kind of thing. And for me, that's the big difference, is somebody in elected office there to serve the public and do the best for the public? And there are some that are, believe it or not, or are they there to feather their own nest? And I suppose, the final thing I'd like to talk about is this G4S scandal. Everybody's noticed this massive G4S story, I guess, over the last, couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. Now, it's amazing, but our little radio show, Bristol Community FM, has been absolutely key part of this story, bizarrely. It's one of those things that sometimes just a story that just lands on your lap and you think, wow. And for many people, they were also offered this story and they went, no, we're not having it. But I looked at it and I thought, this looks like the real McCoy. So anyway, this guy called Ben Fellows was undercover working for G4S. And on the 20th, roughly, of June, I got an email off him saying, I'm undercover working for G4S doing training for the Olympics, right? So this is a month before the Olympics started. And he said, it's a total shambles, right? There are, the people are not being trained properly. There are drug deals going down in the security training classes. The whole thing is a shambles from top to bottom. Uniforms are going missing. People are taking pictures of the Olympic venues when they're not supposed to be, and they could be terrorists. God knows. It's a complete joke. So he came out with this sort of list of various things that, he was saying. The other thing is, it's not just me saying this stuff. Because it's such a disaster, loads of people are gossiping amongst themselves, saying, oh my God, did that happen? No, this happened as well. Anyway, but he was a professional undercover journalist. He worked in security for some quite famous people, like Liliane and people like that. He'd done sort of close protection for these people. But he decided he was going to have a look at G4S. And he emailed Andy Davis at Channel 4 News with this little email saying, look, I'm undercover at G4S, and would you like to, me to tell you something about what's going on before the Olympics? Anyway, Andy Davis, bless him, must have had a look at the header of the email, but he didn't actually even open the email. So he didn't get a reply from Andy Davis. And after, I suppose, a couple of days, he thought, look, I don't want all the hassle of going through the London media. I'll just talk to this guy in Bristol who I know will listen to me. So I got this email, I phoned him up, we had a chat on the phone, and I thought, let's just go for it. I mean, even if he's making it up, what the hell? And I will cross-examine him live, and I did. And I did a 40-minute interview with him on the live interview on the 22nd of June. Now, after that interview, I was getting texts and phone calls from people around the city going, blimey, Tony, that was an interesting one. Is that available online afterwards? Because I'd like to have another listen. It was an explosive interview, really. And what happened was somebody over that weekend, after that Friday, picked up the audio from that 40 minutes, which incidentally, my colleague Martin Summers went into some detail at the end of the interview about how private security is often the cause of the terrorism rather than, going to stop it, that you could pay a private security company to plant a bomb. Blackwater have all these sorts of plans on the shelf there. And they'll say, what do you want to do? We'll organise it for you. All hush hush, but just pay us the money and we'll do it. So this is the realms of PMCs, private military companies. Anyway, G4S is a private military company. It's mostly military people running it, ex-military. They all call themselves by military ranks, this kind of thing. So anyway, G4S trained up this guy. He came on this show for 40 minutes. If you've not heard the interview, it may even be worth having a listen back to it because I listened back to it as well. I think, wow, did this really happen? Anyhow, somebody turned it into a YouTube film. I don't know who it was. They took that audio and they managed to get loads of images off the internet of various things as we were talking about, and they made a film up. As we were talking about, for example, casket linings, which were to put dead bodies in. They had pictures of casket linings from the internet. I don't know where they got them from, but they made a fantastic little YouTube film. Now that was going over, within a few days, it had gone over 200,000 hits. Right, just in a few days. So a lot of people were watching it. It was going all around the world. I heard back from somebody in Bristol who'd had it via someone in Canada. So this interview really did go viral. At which point, it's only because it was on YouTube. Probably, if just been on our own radio station's website, that podcast, it probably wouldn't have done. But someone, bright spark, picked it up. At which point, I started getting phone calls from. I got a phone call from the Mirror. I got a phone call from the BBC. Hey, this is the BBC here. Your interview that's gone viral. Can you give me the number of the guy? I said, no, he's still undercover. You give me your number and I'll pass it on to him. Anyway, these various things happened, and nothing was broadcast. Right? Channel 4 News didn't touch it. BBC didn't touch it. Daily Mirror did a long interview with him, but they had to spike the story. Now, if you think about it, there's a probable reason for that, because if the story had gone in the national press, who would have gone to the Olympics if they'd known that G4S was a load of rubbish, right? It's a fascinating, it's weird to be involved in something like this. Then, what happened was, funnily enough, just a few days after we did this interview on the Friday, the head of MI5 appears with Simon Israel on Channel 4 News saying, we'd just like to reassure everybody, his name's Jonathan Evans, right, that security at the Olympics is absolutely fine. There's nothing to worry about at all. And this is the head of the National Counterintelligence Service, MI5, reassuring everybody that everything is fine at the Olympics, when the reality is it's a total and utter shambles. Now, that guy either should be sacked or locked up. He's not fit to do his job as a spy catcher, which is what MI5 are, right? He's not fit to do his job at all. In fact, I would say misconduct in public office, minimum. What is he doing? Telling the nation to relax and chill out when he knows that is a disastrous situation in the making. Okay, so that was peculiar, right? The other thing is he said at the time was, but one thing we might have to watch out for is the Iranians. the Iranians are planning to possibly attack the Olympics. Now, what does that say about this guy? He's totally corrupt, crooked. He's also, funnily enough, a Bilderberger, to go back to the Nazis. Right? Jonathan Evans, head of MI5, paid an absolute fortune to talk rot on Channel 4 News and lie to us. So that all happened, and then all of a sudden, I was driving back from Western in the car in the city centre about 3:30, 4 o'clock one afternoon. Radio 5 Live. 3,500 troops are being drafted in to the Olympics. G4S, total shambles. Now, you know, I actually literally put the car onto one side, got out, bloody hell, you know, something's happened. And the interesting thing is, in a way, I kind of commend the establishment for doing it that way, because then they hit on Olympics, right? If the story had got out as it was, shambles, it would have been complete panic. I had one of the girls at our radio station come up to me after we did this interview, and she said, I don't want to go to the Olympics. I mean, she's only a teenager. I don't want to go to the Olympics. I don't know how to tell my mum. You know, she's got tickets and everything. I don't want to go. So you just think about the way this touches people, right? Something like this. But anyway, they've come out, the army's moved in, right? And I mean, a lot of people have been saying online, oh, it's the militarisation of London, you know, it's a big sinister conspiracy, a big takeover. Look, rubbish, right? Complete nonsense. What's happened is G4S were going to make £300 million, right? Cash in their pockets, probably go straight to some tax haven somewhere. And then, in fact, they are based abroad. The company is, but it's not a British company. And they were going to do next to no work for it. You know, basically, that was what was going on. This whole thing is a total scam. G4S making £300 million and doing a really shoddy job with the security of the Olympics. But that's thankfully been stopped now. And of course, if it had been allowed to happen, it was wide open not only to a terrorist, if they really wanted to target the Olympics, which seems a bit stupid and pointless to me, but most importantly to a false flag attack. That is to say, some of our allies like the United States, even the Brits, planting a bomb and then blaming it on the Iranians. Because if you hadn't noticed, there's a whole battle fleets and battle groups all around Iran at the moment straining to attack. And in Syria, we've got a whole NATO army basically in there. Well, not a NATO army, but a proxy army. Turkey, which is part of NATO, is supplying all these rebels. It's just come out today that the money is all coming in for the rebels from Saudi Arabia, who are our allies, and Qatar. You know, this is a proxy war that's being fought inside Syria. And what they really want is an excuse to make it much bigger. And if they have a false flag attack, they blame it on the Iranians at the Olympics. Perfect excuse. We're going to have to go, you know, like they did with 9/11 and with Afghanistan. So that, I suppose, has taught me quite a bit about how the establishment really works. I mean, I worked at the BBC years ago in the early 90s, and I'll finish up with this, right? On the drive time show and the lunchtime news programmes in London. And it was really, you know, I can tell you, radio is a drug, because you are the first people to the story. When we had a bomb at the stock exchange, for example, when I was working there by the IRA, we were the first people there, not because we had reporters there. Okay, reporters were sent, one was sent on the tube system, another was sent on a motorbike. You know, when a big thing like that happens and you've got some reporting resources, you send various people to see who's going to get there first. And whoever gets there, it's a race for the reporters to get there first from the different radio stations as well, and to be reporting first on the live. But what I did is I simply got on the phone. I spoke to a mate of mine that worked near the stock exchange, and spoke to him in his office. He said, oh yeah, well, we can't see anything from here, but if you phone Royal Bank of Scotland, they're on the opposite side, they can see everything. So we just put, like, literally within a few minutes, and we got this voice of God in the ceiling in our newsroom, which is Broadcasting House, talking to the local radio stations. There has been a bomb at the stock exchange. Oh, crikey, right. And then everyone starts moving. The quickest way of doing it was simply to phone up, and I got this guy. He just was working for Royal Bank of Scotland, looking out over the stock exchange. And he was live, he was a good talker, so we patched him straight through to the studio, and he was describing the scene to London, anyone that was bothering to listen to Greater London Radio, and we were quite well listened to station, and he was describing the scene as the police were arriving at this, you know, wrecked, bombed scene. And so we were first, right? And it really was, I don't know, you felt like it was all worthwhile. The reason is because whoever gets to the story first gets the first bite of the cherry, gets the first chance to interpret events. And often the whole way a story unfolds is interpreted by the first journalist to comment on the scene. Now, in this particular case, it wasn't a journalist commenting, it was just an employee of the Royal Bank of Scotland. But it was our presenter in the studio that was doing all this first commentary on it, which is why I still do radio. I love it. And, you know, I hope some of you will be able to listen in the future, because we still do break stories here. As I said with this G4S story, there's quite regularly some big stuff that comes out, you know, maybe through a statement made by one of the people on the council here, or, for example, things like there was a case of child abuse a few years ago that we did as a, you know, basically other people around the country picked up on it afterwards, but we are able to break stories. And I suppose what we're trying to do as a little team here in Bristol on this particular show, which is basically Martin Summers, Marina Morris, Marina's husband as well, who's an used to work in the prison service. We're all kind of public service people, and what we try and do is provide actually what is a national and international news programme from a regional city. Now, why do we do that? Well, if anyone knows where The Guardian came from, that's how they started in Manchester. This is a provincial city with a national and international outlook. And don't tell me that Bristol has not got the ability to comment on what's going on in the rest of the world. We have to take all our lies from London and then just shove them out to the public. I think as a city, we have every capability, what with our hundreds of thousands of people here, and our multi-ethnic community from all over the world, and saying what we think about what's going on in the world as separate to what London thinks, because London is under control. All those editors, all those managers really are, you know, it's like they speak with one voice. Look at what's been going on with The Guardian in Syria, for example, the Syria coverage. The Guardian do a fantastic job on lots of things, but their coverage on Syria has been absolutely one-sided behind the rebels. Oh, Assad is the latest bad guy. And, you know, so that there is a tremendous amount of control in London, and we've got a bit of freedom, the 4 or 5 of us that work producing that show every week. So that's it, really. I'd just like to finish and say I think everyone can do a little bit, whatever that is, and that's my bit I've done, and I've, you know. That Bormann raised, for example, there's absolute cast iron evidence now that a lot of the gold that was in Nazi gold bars with the Nazi crest on was taken up to New York to Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, and that they arranged for it to be laundered, melted down, and turned into Federal Reserve gold bars up in New York. And this money was then, after it had been laundered, as they do in the City of London now, as we were hearing, was invested into all these businesses. And so that's why I think this is an important book, because Manning was a CBS news correspondent during World War II. If you read the book, you'll see he and 4 or 5 other correspondents were handpicked to go actually on bombing missions over Germany. So they could report back, if they managed to survive, the next day on the news to the whole of the United States, to let people know in America on the radio what it was like, what was going on in Europe. So they were quite plucky characters, and Manning was not happy when he realised that all this looted money from the war had been virtually ignored. Now, why, I'm going to throw this question out, why was it ignored virtually by you know, Britain, by America? If they knew, they had intelligence reports that all this money was in South America, why did they ignore it? So any ideas? Huh?
Someone online has to benefit. Would it be for the Troika? The European monarchy, the Vatican and the bankers?
Not at that point. I mean, we're talking about the late 40s, early 50s, remember? Okay? They had the intelligence that this was going on in South America, but they ignored it. And the reason was the threat at that time was the Russians. Okay? And they wanted to work with ex-Nazis who had been working in Eastern Europe to fight the Russians. And so there was a blind eye turned to it. By Britain, by the United States, at the highest levels. So they were saying, well, yes, we know these Nazis, yes, yes, but we won the war, so let's sort of, you know, be nice to them. And so let's just leave it as it is, you know. Let's not cause too much of a fuss, because some of these Nazis are really being helpful and they've got good information on the Russians, who are our big threat now. In fact, Reinhard Gehlen, who was one of the heads of the Gestapo in the Second World War, was actually then made the head of the German Secret Service, officially. Now, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I don't know if anyone noticed, Heinz Fromm, who's the head of the German Secret Service, was, up until 3 or 4 weeks ago, resigned, because it was proved that he was helping neo-Nazi groups right now in Germany. So this Nazi thread has not gone away, right? It's under the surface in business and also in terrorist attacks in Germany, which, and by the way, that neo-Nazi group, that Heinz Fromm, who's thankfully been sacked, I mean, it'd be nice if we could see the same kind of courage from our government, sacking far-right people who are in our security services, for example, but they don't. They do in Germany. And that group was also involved in the Munich Olympics, the murder of Israelis. Now it all starts to get a bit weird, doesn't it? Because you've got, it was blamed on Palestinians at the time in the Munich Olympics. I think it was 72. But it turns out that this neo-Nazi group that Heinz Fromm has been helping also took part in that attack on the Israelis. So interesting that the Nazis were still around in the 70s killing Jewish people. And yet that was kind of swept under the carpet and it was blamed on the Palestinians. Now, I think it's very unwise of the Israeli state, for example, at these current Olympics that are going on right now, to start talking about the Munich, right? Because as soon as you start looking into Munich, you see there's a whole can of worms there. Do you really want to talk about that? Not like to eat the food that Hitler was serving, whereas Bormann was happy, you know, eating away. And Hess brought his own chef. And Hitler noticed at one of the meals, you haven't been eating my food, right? And this was very hurtful to Hess, because he thought, oh no, I've fallen out of favour. And this was one of the reasons he decided to make this flight to Britain. And he parachuted up into Scotland, where he knew there was a very high-ranking and actually quite pro-Nazi Lord, Hamilton, I think it was. And he parachuted into his place. Anyway, he was captured, and the rest is history. He spent the rest of his life in Spandau prison. But this left Bormann as the key guy, right? So Bormann had all the power now. And he was a bureaucrat. He was very boring. He did things like set up businesses, set up companies, organised the lower echelons of the Nazi party, and also, most importantly, he was basically Hitler's treasurer. So all of the wealth that was being looted across Europe from 1939 all the way through to actually 38, all the way through till 1945, Bormann was in charge of where it was going. I mean, the thing is, the types of stuff that was being looted were obviously precious metals, things like gold, that kind of thing. Every time the Nazis came to a new estate, they'd go straight for the cellars and for the safes to try and find all of the loot. There were also securities, that is to say, share certificates, this kind of thing, all very valuable material. Artwork, paintings, all of this was very systematically brought back to Berlin. And the other thing is patents. Sometimes there were like secret plans of new ideas, technical expertise. This was all very valuable stuff. And as the Nazi armies rolled across Europe, this was one of their prime roles was to identify this stuff and get it back to Berlin. And it was Bormann's job to be in charge of all this. So this book, Nazi in Exile, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, was really the only examination of what happened to Bormann after the war. Because when Hitler died in his bunker, I know there's some people that don't believe he did, I certainly do believe he did, and I spoke to someone who saw his body as well, who lives in, still alive, and lives in Marlborough, a guy called Harry Beckhoff. He escaped down these Vatican rat lines to Switzerland originally, and then eventually to South America. And if you ever see an old World in Action film, was made in the 1970s by John Ware, who's now the head of Panorama at the BBC, even though now he seems to be a bit of a gatekeeper. He was filming over in Paraguay and Brazil, filming these Nazis. Well, I mean, he was over there filming places where they'd identified as being living. Now, but Bormann hadn't been idle. over there. He was a very busy little bureaucrat, and as soon as the war was finished and he made it over to South America, he started setting up companies. He set up 750 new firms in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And in those new firms, what he did is he made supporters of the SS, the international supporters of the SS, and he made actual SS people. Obviously, they'd taken their SS uniforms off and their swastikas off, and they put nice suits on, and they were now directors of companies. They were no longer Nazis in uniform, they were directors of companies. And these companies, many of them still exist today. The only thing is, there was a whole money laundering operation going on, so a lot of these paintings were sold on the black market, etc. And the money that they The book's called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. Now, does anyone here know who Martin Bormann was?
Yeah.
No, that was Albert Speer, who was Hitler's armaments minister and also architect, who Prince Charles is a big admirer of, and who's quite well described in Jonathan Mead's TV programme that he did, a half-hour, I think it's maybe even 40-minute long programme called Jerry Building. Now, this is a really powerful programme. If you've never seen it, watch it online, because it's all about Nazi architecture, and all that their architecture tells you about the cult nature of their society. And funnily enough, when the BBC released Jonathan Mead's collection of his films, that best and most important film is not on the collection. Which kind of leads me on to explaining a bit more about Jonathan Mead's and that. But let's finish with Martin Bormann first. Bormann, I don't know how many people know how Hitler used to run his empire. It was basically, Adolf was in charge, but all of his minions, what he used to do is he used to play this divide and rule thing with them. So every position, there were two or possibly even more people vying for that position and for his favour. So he could play one off against the other. And they were constantly trying to ingratiate themselves to Hitler, to do more and more for him. And this meant that they would get more and more ruthless. So this is the way that these modern day hierarchical systems work too, is you're constantly giving the impression to, say for example, your middle managers in a corrupt business, like one of the big oil companies, that they can make it to the top, but only if they show their loyalty by doing exactly what you want and the stuff that you've asked them to do down the pub, off the record. And Hitler used to do this all the time. And the most important position through the Nazi years was this deputy to Hitler. Now, there were two people. Bormann was one. And does anyone know the name of the other one who's played off against? See, this is our history. We've really got to know this. We fought these people. Our grandparents, aunties and uncles died fighting them. And yet we don't necessarily understand how they operated, because the history, okay, there's bits and pieces on the Yesterday channel, but we don't necessarily understand it. The other guy was Hermann Hesse, right? There were two, through most of the early part of the war, who were vying constantly for Hitler's favour as his deputy, Martin Bormann and Rudolf Hess. Now, however you want to characterise it, Hess was an interesting guy. I mean, I think actually he got to a certain stage down the road in Nazi Germany where he realised, actually, this thing that we've created in Germany is like a monstrous idea. And he decided on his own that he would try and make peace with Britain. This was, by the way, was a way of trying to ingratiate himself to Hitler again, right? By going on a secret mission to Britain. And he parachuted out of a plane into up in Scotland somewhere, and then he was captured. But the reason he did this is because he'd been going to Hitler's Berghof with Bormann as well, all dining with Hitler. So you got Hess and Bormann both vying for his... And for whatever reason, Hess didn't... We will cut off financial support for your nice new country. Right, this is in the 1960s. Israel was still getting bigger and bigger. Yeah? And so... basically, money talks. yeah, and Nazi money talks. And Nazi money can even buy the Israeli or Jewish leadership. So they're saying to themselves, well, we can't really survive if we haven't got this money coming into the country, we really need it. Oh, okay. Oh, well, let's just go the same way the Brits and the Americans have gone and forget about it. So he was the last guy that was, and Issa Harel was then sacked on some other pretext. So that was the point, really, I think. It's interesting to identify where Israel as a nation lost its soul, really. So they had decided, well, I'll tell you what, we're the government. It might be hassle for us if we continue following these very wealthy war criminals. And I suppose the other thing about all this is the film, which you can also watch online. It's one of these old World in Action films about Joseph Mengele. Because it's very clear there that he was basically the doctor who was looking after all these war criminals. So if one of them got ill, needed an injection or whatever, they'd go to Mengele. And what John Ware and his team did was a brilliant bit of investigative journalism. I mean, this stuff I get excited about. It's so sad. I'm afraid that's what I'm like. But what they did is they got a nice-looking blonde German woman, and with nice curly hair, and she was with another woman who had a hidden camera in a bag. And what they were doing then was going around Buenos Aires, finding all these ex-Nazis, and this blonde woman would say to them, "Oh yeah, I'm a big supporter of the SS, and I'm being hassled," and come up with a whole story. Right, and because of course she was like a honey trap, really, and all these Nazis were going, "Oh, she's nice," and "Oh, she needs my help," and they were chatting to her in bars and pubs, but she had a hidden microphone, and the woman who was on the other side of the room was filming the whole time with her just out of camera, so you can just about see her golden locks occasionally. But it's a brilliant bit of filming, and some of the people that she films are pretty hideous characters too. One of them, for example, going on about, "Oh, I see all these disabled people around Buenos Aires, they make me sick. We've got to get rid of them. What are they still doing, these disgusting people?" And so you can see that there was this whole, basically eugenics, master race, Nazi mentality was very much alive and well in this Bormann network and in South America, right up until the 70s when this was filmed, this John Ware documentary. And this is why I say, look at the financial networks today. Right? And we have to question. I mean, it's very difficult to make exact links, although there's loads of clues in the Manning book when he talks about specific companies which were invested with this Nazi money. But it's quite clear that that kind of cult mentality and criminality is still very much alive in places like the City of London today. Okay, over the last few weeks we've seen the LIBOR scandal with Barclays. Now that scandal is really high-level criminality, massive crime going on. We're talking about billions of pounds being robbed from people, from their basically charging them too much for their mortgages, taking a little bit out of all these people who've got loans every month. Now, it's not just mortgages, but the LIBOR rate is used for all sorts of other loans as well, for example, business loans, right? So almost everybody that's got a loan is affected by that rate in one way or another. It's the key rate which is used. So as they're messing about with the rate, they're stealing from. Anyway, so getting back to Bormann and the Nazis over in South America, the whole point of that operation by Paul Manning and the book was to point out this threat, this financial threat, which nobody else was really doing. He used his own money to write the book, right? There was no publisher helping him. He spent 2 years of his life working on it, and I think if you ever get round to reading it, you'll find it's a terrific read as well, because you can see that the guy he's a basically proper journalist who's lived through the war, survived bombing missions over Germany, etc., and he's decided, right, okay, I'm going to write this. Now, the nice thing about the book is it's free, it's available as a PDF. If you want to buy an actual real copy of the book from the 1980s when it was first published, that costs about 100 quid, something like that. Sometimes there was another copy I saw online a few days ago for 400 quid. But you can get a PDF of it. His first son was shot in the head a few weeks after the book was published in New York. No apparent reason. Bang, dead. His publisher had his legs broken. So it does indicate it might be worth reading the book. So anyway, fast forward a little bit to the 60s, and as I said, the British and the Americans had given up on any idea of pursuing Nazi war criminals, right? It was like Nuremberg's gone, but there was one organisation that hadn't. Do you know who that was? The Mossad. The Israeli Mossad had a team over there led by a guy called Issa Harel, who himself had been actually a kind of Jewish terrorist, overthrowing British rule. But he was absolutely clear. Now we've made a bit of space in Israel, our job is to go and hunt down some of these war criminals. And they were. They were sneaking around South America, cataloguing these people, having a chat to people. And one of the ways that what he managed to do is he identified several people, including Bormann, as living there. And one of the key people was that there was a lot of pressure in Israel for them to find was the guy from Auschwitz, who was the doctor, notorious doctor, Adolf Eichmann. Now, there's Dr. Mengele, sorry. Mengele was there. Eichmann was also there, who was one of the people who was a key person in this whole sort of final solution to kill all the Jews and made this a massive thing. Anyway, they actually managed to kidnap Adolf Eichmann. They found him, kidnapped him, put him on a plane at Buenos Aires airport. And then they thought, well, we've got him in handcuffs on this plane. Before we take off, shall we see if we can find any more of these war criminals? And they actually had tracked down Bormann and Mengele. And so they went to this boarding house where they thought they were, this Mossad team, knocked on the door. Oh, we're sorry that they went a couple of days ago. So they realised, oh, we've missed them. So they just flew off with Adolf Eichmann to Jerusalem, having obviously, you know, sort of slightly annoyed the Argentinians. But there's a big German expat community over in South America, particularly in Patagonia. So there was a lot of support for these ex-Nazis there. And when they got to Jerusalem, Eichmann was put on trial and executed. Now, when that happened, there was a sort of shockwaves going around the world, right? We neglected this guy. The Mossad have now got him, and he's now been executed. Why didn't we do it? There were all sorts of questions being asked right around the world. But the most important question, which was actually came from the Bormann network itself, which was, if you carry on this escapade, Israel,